Hello, welcome to the AT&T CyberThreat Report for March 22nd, 2012. Joining us today, we have Jim Clausing. Jim Clausing is a malware analyst and security expert. Welcome, Jim. And what do you have to discuss with us today?
Thanks, Brian. Today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the latest Android malware that we're seeing out there.
That should be interesting. You know, there have been some articles about how something needs to be done about this malware problem in the Android markets, and so this is probably another good example to discuss. We also have Dave Gross with us today. Dave is an incident response analyst with a long background in system management and development. Welcome, Dave. And what do you plan to discuss with us today?
Thanks, Brian. Today I'm going to discuss malicious code signed with stolen certificates. It seems to be a growing trend that we should be aware of.
Yes, and you know, we've seen a number of trends associated with using certificates in other rogue ways as well. Perhaps we can have a little discussion about that. But clearly, there's going to be a need to address the security of security certificates. We also will have a somewhat in-depth discussion from John Hogoboom today. John Hogoboom is a security analyst and a botnet tracker. John, what do you plan to discuss?
Hey, Brian. So today I took a closer look at one of the particular spams that we've been seeing. We've been seeing a lot of this one. So instead of going through the whole kind of overview, I'm going to take a deeper dive into one in particular, and it's one that uses exploit kits, a drive-by exploit kit. We're going to talk about those and how those work, and we're going to take a closer look at exactly how a machine gets infected without any user intervention. So it's a be interesting one to talk about.
Absolutely. These exploit kits are getting pretty sophisticated and pretty nefarious as well. So it'll be, I think, very helpful to take a close look at that. I'm Brian Rexroad. I'll cover the internet weather today, a regular portion of a report. And with that, let's go ahead and one of the things I wanted to share with you today, as always, if you want to contact us, I'm showing something on the display here. You can always contact us through email at cyberthreat@list.att.com. And I just wanted to call your attention to the fact that the AT&T does have an exchange blog, a networking exchange blog. This is an opportunity for employees of the company to share information with folks on the Internet. And the domain for that, to visit the exchange blog, is networkingexchangeblog.att.com. And I'm showing a link here, the URL, if you're interested in the topics of security. There is a security category in there, and I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I've posted a blog on there that was posted today. There are actually several others that contribute to this program that have contributed blogs, as well as other folks that are involved in security around AT&T. So if you have an interest in security beyond this program, if you're interested in reading some things, the blog that I posted today is discussing a little bit of what kinds of things could be done in the network to protect against certain types of security threats. I used the DNS changer Trojan as an example. But, you know, in some cases, at least the perception of the policy and what should be done in terms of controlling the Internet, in some cases inhibits the opportunity to do that. So take a look at that if you're interested. And you can also contact us through Twitter. Jim Clausing and I both have Twitter accounts. You can reach mine at Brian Rexroad, and Jim's is J. Clausing. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the topics for today. I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Jim, and what's going on in the mobile malware space.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, we haven't talked about the Android malware a whole lot lately, but it's still out there and still seeing new samples on a fairly regular basis. And there was one that caught my attention today that I just wanted to mention. This one is called TGLoader, and it's very similar to ones we've seen in the past. It involves repackaging a legitimate Android application. It has to date only been found on some of the alternate Android markets. This particular one uses a relatively old root exploit to root the phone. This one it uses the exploit root exploit, which is a variant of what was used back with Droid Dream, which is one of the older instances of Android malware. In this particular case, what it does is, after it roots the phone, installs a new service, and then downloads some additional secondary payloads. The primary one seems to be one that does SMS to premium SMS numbers. So one of the standard ways that the bad guys seem to use the mobile devices is doing SMS behind the scenes to these premium numbers. They make some money for whoever's running the premium service, and then they disappear before anybody gets a chance to track them down. Mm-hmm. But this one also does check in with the command and control and has the ability to install some additional different payloads at some point in the future. So it's one to keep an eye on. Yeah, like I said, it's nothing particularly new. It's the same kind of things we've seen before, but they're still out there. They're still happening in these alternate markets, so I figured it was worth a mention since we hadn't talked about it in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are starting to see some trends here in the types of things that they tend to be doing in the mobile space, and I guess we shouldn't expect that to be sort of a stability aspect. That is, we should expect to see other things going on in the future, but certainly there are some trends in the types of things that we're seeing here. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned that it's using an older exploit. Does that imply that updated versions of Android are resistant to that exploit, or would they still be subject to being exploited with that?
Unfortunately, this exploit does seem to work on relatively new. I'm not sure that it works on the latest, the ice cream sandwich, the Android 4, mm-hmm. or even necessarily the honeycomb systems, but most of the phones are still running 2.3 variants, and most of those are still going to be susceptible to this.
Okay. So it'll be something to be paying attention to. We've talked about it a number of times before. I think this is just another reinforcement that is, if you have a smartphone, it's sort of a new era. You need to keep that device updated to the latest version of software to make sure that, clearly there's a little question here about what versions are exploitable with this particular piece of malware, but clearly, Ed Amoroso, our Chief Security Officer, has oftentimes said in the past that what we've done is become super patchers, folks that are working in an enterprise and managing enterprise IT services have had to become very reactive to vulnerability patches that are being put out and make sure that they get installed quickly. Smartphones are no exception to that.
Yeah, well, and with the Android OS itself, with the mobile phones, you're often at the mercy of the carrier. Yep. Until the carrier is ready to say that they support the latest version, they're not going to push it out to the phones. So you're stuck running whatever version was on there before, and if there's a patched version that protects against a particular exploit, until your carrier is ready to say that they're comfortable with that version of the OS on the device, they're not going to push it out to the phones.
Right, and some of that may also depend on the phone providers themselves. I mean, the vendor of the phone has to certify a newer version of the iOS or whatever, or the iOS or the Android.
Yep, good points. All right, thank you, Jim. Let's go ahead and see what Dave has here. Dave, you'd mentioned something about stolen certificates being used in nefarious ways.
Yes, thank you, Brian. This is a problem that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, originally the idea was if you had code and if you used a public-private kind of key situation where you have the code signer having a private key and have a public key where you can validate that that is signed properly, then you can have more trust in the code that you're receiving. Unfortunately, there's been cases over the years where that trust has broken down. There's been some very, well-publicized things like the Stuxnet code, where the certificates that were used there were from a couple of companies in Taiwan that develop software and hardware. So, those it looked like those certificates were stolen in order to be able to do that. There was also, in 2010, a version of Zeus used a certificate that was stolen from Kaspersky Labs. So security companies aren't immune to this either. Mm-hmm. There's also examples where there was an infected PDF file that came out from a credit union, signed by the certificate of a credit union. There were some that was from GameForge, which is a German gaming company, and Blackbaud, which is a software company. There was even one that came in 2011, which was signed by a segment of the Malaysian government, the Malaysian Agricultural R&D Institute. And most recently, Symantec has identified something called MetaYes. It's a dropper program, and it was signed by Compavi AG, which is a Swiss firm. And again, they identified that this was a stolen certificate, a stolen private key there. There's also malware out there that targets private key certificates. There's one called infostealer.nimkey that was identified in 2010 that finds these things. And AVG, the antivirus company, put out a report back in 2011, I think maybe second quarter 2011 or something, basically saying that for what they've seen, they saw in 2009 30,000 samples that were signed with stolen certificates or questionable certificates. In 2010, there were 40,000. 2011, they were on track to do like 90,000 or so. And, basically the idea is with these signed code modules, a lot of the security software doesn't pay as much attention to it because it's supposed to be more trusted. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of times they're either whitelisted or, not analyzed in depth. So it's a growing problem, and I think we may have to back off somewhat on feeling that signed code is adequate to have trust. I mean, it's something that raises the bar a little bit so that, at least you have something signed as opposed to something that's totally unsigned, but you really can't trust it that much. And, of course, a lot of self-signed certificates aren't trusted at all.
Right. So, boy, this one, I'm trying to think of where to even start on this, because there are all kinds of questions this perhaps raises. Now, I want to try to understand a little bit better. It sounds like in most cases you're referring to signing certificates. This is application signing certificates. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So it's application signing certificates that apparently the private key has been stolen from the signing organization. Is that correct?
That's what it seems like. It seems like there are some ones, like they were talking about the Blackbaud one, for example, where there was an intrusion into their infrastructure specifically looking for that.
Right. And, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but to my knowledge, is there any sort of a certificate revocation or signing certificate revocation infrastructure associated with application signing?
Supposedly there is. I mean, I haven't really gone to investigate it, but from what I've read, there are revocations for these kinds of certificates as well. The problem is when you go to check these things, the revocation, you're going to delay the running of the program.
Absolutely.
And so that's going to have a big performance impact.
Absolutely. So there would need to be some sort of an optimization, that is how often you check it, or perhaps it's checked in the installation process, perhaps, but and then maybe infrequently checked after that. Because this is a case, perhaps, where the application was installed. It may have been nefarious, but they didn't know that the certificate was stolen, and perhaps at a different time later in time it was discovered that it was stolen. So you'd need to sort of renew that check from time to time.
Well, and there have also been intrusions into certificate authorities themselves, and we've talked about that in previous shows here. And in those cases, certificates issued by that whole certificate authority, at least under the old certificate, is made invalid.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim,
well, and with some of the application signing stuff, if you're talking about applications that are signed on Windows, in some cases when you want to revoke the certificates, you have to go through Microsoft to do it, and then you have to wait for the next round of Microsoft patches on the second Tuesday of the month. You could be sitting there for quite several weeks before this happens. So
right.
The speed of revocation isn't necessarily quick, even when there is an infrastructure for it.
Right. There's supposed to be, at least for SSL certificates, there's a certificate revocation list that is dynamically updated and checked, or supposed to be checked. Generally speaking, it doesn't get performed, and that was kind of what I was referring to, is that perhaps a similar kind of infrastructure is what's needed for applications as well. And you're right, Jim. Waiting for a round of updates on the platform is probably not the most ideal way, because at that point you might as well do something to remove any suspected malware at that point. So this is obviously a difficult problem to solve. It sounds like the challenge has to do with really putting some good standards and practices around protecting the keys associated with signing things, and having perhaps a more robust revocation process around it. Perhaps there are some good ideas that are out there about how this could be restructured to do a better job, but I certainly am at a loss for a better way other than to make good improvements to the existing processes, in practice.
And, when you run an application, you can't always assume that you have access to a network to check a revocation list, whereas with a browser, you can sometimes make some assumptions there that if I'm going to a website, I have some network connectivity where I can go to VeriSign or somebody to check a revocation list and see if it's still valid or not. But
you're absolutely right.
That's the case of applications.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, John. What I was kind of implying, and we can't really get into a lot of details here, but if, for example, when the application is installed, that would be a good time to check to see if the signing certificate's been revoked. It's most likely being downloaded from a site anyway, so that's a good opportunity. And then in other cases, perhaps maybe once a month or something to check, or do that as a part of the regular update process to see if there's been a revocation. There are probably a lot of ways that the process could be improved upon in terms of what is, in comparison to what is actually practiced today. Anyway. A very good discussion, and as you can obviously see, this is one that, first of all, the number of examples that you provided, Dave, is a little bit sobering, and then secondly, clearly there's a need to make some improvements in the way we provide some sort of sense of trust associated with software. And then, the third aspect of this that you didn't even touch on is that even if it is signed, it could have all kinds of vulnerabilities It may not have been Trojaned yet, but as Jim pointed out earlier, even, older exploits may be effective on software, so we have to be paying attention to that as well.
Right.
Okay, so very good. That probably is a good dovetail into the next piece that we're going to talk about here. John, you were going to talk a little bit about some exploit kit, drive-by infections. What can you tell us?
All right, and tangentially, we're going to talk about something Dave mentioned with the certificates here, because this particular sample we're going to look at has not a stolen certificate, but it is digitally signed with a highly suspect certificate, and we'll look at that in a minute. But first off, I wanted to mention, we had talked maybe 2-3 weeks ago about Crydex came out, and Crydex is a password-stealing Trojan that it was kind of triggered by users getting emails. If they clicked on links in those emails, they would get driven to a web page that would have some variant of a drive-by exploit kit on it, on that web page, which would infect the user silently and download the Crydex Trojan. Well, we're going to take a look at another similar one. The Blackhole exploit kit as well as the Phoenix exploit kit are two very popular exploit kits. And basically what they are is it's a set of code that they basically will build a web page for you. It's going to be highly obfuscated, but it's going to try a bunch of things. It's going to try a bunch of common browser exploits that it knows about. It's going to try some Shockwave Flash, some Adobe Acrobat PDF ones, as well as some Java exploits, and there might be a few others that I'm missing in there. So it tries a whole suite of exploits that it can trigger through your browser without you clicking on anything other than going to the web page. And if any of those succeed, it can drop a payload down onto your machine and then execute that payload. So the important point about exploit kits is they're not really a virus or a Trojan themselves. They're more of what we would call a Trojan downloader. They're really to facilitate the installation of malware onto a person's machine. So, jumping ahead, let's take a look at what we've seen in the past couple of days here. If you look at in the press, you're going to find a lot of people talking about this one as well, which I was doing this morning. There's been a run of spam. Normally, during my segment, we talk about the spam reports and the trends that we're seeing. I'm going to pick this one out in particular today because we're seeing a lot of it, and I think there's a lot of people actually biting on it, so to speak, and getting infected. So I wanted to make people aware of this. So here's a sample of it, and basically what they're doing is they're purporting to be coming from LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a kind of social networking site, but more for the business aspect, to link with other coworkers and other colleagues you might have in whatever industry you're in. And this email looks pretty authentic, actually. It comes in, says you've got a reminder that someone invited to link in with you. And a couple of little nuggets here that you can look for that are a little fishy. First of all, it'll usually, from the samples I saw, and we've had tons of these samples, hundreds and hundreds of them in our spam collection analysis, but they will usually have a fictional, I just changed this to fictional user, but it'd be some name, like Jim Jones, it would say here, and then the 2 would be Jim Jones at att.net. So the from and the to tend to align with the same person. So, but the email address itself is not really that person. The from, it's some other email address, and they just changed the description text to match up with the person they're sending to. Why, I don't know. Just an artifact of the way this works that's interesting that you can look for. In terms of the subjects, we're seeing these subjects that I have listed here: connection, LinkedIn mail, communication, LinkedIn mail, a lot of them ending with LinkedIn mail and some other word in front of there. Although there have been a couple here that say LinkedIn invitation from your coworker, another LinkedIn invitation from your colleague. So just be wary that if you are getting or seeing emails like these, don't click on any of the links that are in here because they go to a malicious drive-by website. And I'm going to show you how that works. This works a lot like all of them do, because this is how the Blackhole exploit kit works, and we're going to kind of talk about that until it ultimately delivers the payload. So this is really what Blackhole does. First off, the link in that email that we were looking at points to a hacked website. So I have a whole list on the next page of hacked websites. These are legitimate websites that have been hacked. So they're not necessarily bad. It's just that they've been compromised in some way, and they've had this payload put onto a page. A lot of them have kind of this random name and a directory path with index.html, and there's a lot of repetition in there on these various websites. If you actually clicked on that link and went there, what you would see is it's going to go try to fetch some JavaScript here from another website. So your browser, first step, goes up here to this hacked website, gets a instruction to go download JavaScript from another website. So that's step 2. It goes to this other website, downloads this JavaScript. All that does is tells your browser to go to a new location, document.location, and it's pointing to this bluecellular.com/showthread.php, blah, 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 blah. This also, I should point out, I know I'm doodling all over the screen here, this pattern here of /showthread.php $T equals and a hex number is very Blackhole exploit kit-ish. If you see that, your alarm bells, your hackles should go up. Be wary of when you see that in any URLs that you might be looking in your log files. So your browser receives this message, gets redirected to the ultimate landing page of this Blackhole exploit kit web page, which I call the Beck web page. This particular sample I looked at they're all pointing to bluecellular.com. So if there was anything that you're going to block from what I'm telling you today, look for any activity to bluecellular.com and be very wary of it. This is not a legitimate website in any respect. We're going to take a look at that and prove that in a second. In any event, what you actually your browser receives here, and this is probably too hard to see, but I couldn't really get it without in any larger format, but it's a bunch of obfuscated JavaScript that unpacks itself and attempts to run all those various exploits that I talked about: Java, Flash, PDF, browser exploits to try to drop a payload on your machine. This is just a page of a few. This is not all of them, of the ones that we saw, the different websites. So there's plenty. These are legitimate websites that are the initial landing page that jumps you over to that other JavaScript and then ultimately to the bluecellular.com webpage. You'll notice, or you'll find that a lot of these, the way these guys work is that's how they do it. They kind of have these a hacked website or some interstitial web page that they're using to bounce between. It's kind of a little hopscotch game they play to bounce your browser between a few sites until it ultimately lands at the ultimate page that has the exploit kit loader on it.
Yeah, just for our folks that are just listening, John, I wanted to sort of point out that what you were showing was a page that showed the better part of at least 80 or so different websites that this was pointing to.
Yes, that's about right.
And it looks like the part before the index.html has maybe 8 or 10 characters that are letters and numbers mixed that don't spell out any words or anything.
Right, that's right. And there's a lot of repetition in those patterns too, but I haven't done an analysis to see if there's a fixed number of what those patterns are.
Yeah, so perhaps some of those patterns suggest that it's really hosted by the same web server and separate domain names, or there's some sort of proxying perhaps that's going on behind the scenes?
I don't think so. They're all different websites for sure. I did do a check on that. Okay. There's no linkage between all of them there. So I think it's just however the worm decides to drop it onto the infected website. Mm-hmm. They're just using some certain patterns there. Okay. So from your perspective, if you were to actually click on one of these links, I want to kind of show you what you would see. This is very typical of Blackhole Exploit Kit. You're going to see the first page will say, "Wait, please, loading." That's actually served up from the hacked website. And that was it. We kind of saw that on the initial in the HTML there. If you look closely, you'd see it does that. And that's going to redirect you along the way until you finally hit the second page here, which is the actual Blackhole Exploit Kit loader page. And you'll notice you'll probably see a Java applet loading in the top left-hand frame. I've actually seen cases where they'll load multiple instances of Java. So you'll see 4 or 5 boxes of Java loading. And it will almost always say, "Please wait, page is loading," ... in big letters. While this is running and loading, it's trying a bunch of different exploits. Ultimately, it may even crash on your machine, happens with us frequently that it crashes the browser, but the payload actually gets dropped and the malware actually gets executed on the machine. So it's able to do its thing. It just crashes the browser in the process.
Right. So, John, that kind of brings something to mind here, particularly with Java. I think one of the thing that, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is that, certain Java-enabled applications may require a specific version of Java to operate. There's the underlying the virtual machine. And so it's possible to have older versions of the Java engine on your machine. Is that correct?
Yeah, you could have multiple versions. Usually your browser is going to point to one in particular, though.
Right.
But that's very possible that you could have more than one version of Java in your machine. I know in a lot of corporate environments, sometimes it's set to a low version of Java because some corporate-developed application is not forward compatible with the new version of Java. So that's something to be wary of if that's if that scenario holds in your environment. I don't know whether the Java exploit is, there's a lot of exploits loading here. Java's just one of them that it's trying. So even if you had Java disabled, if your Adobe Acrobat's not updated or any other variety of exploits that it's trying, if it can get any one of those to work, it's going to use it in order to infect your machine.
Yeah, and one of the things about the Java, we've mentioned it in the past, the more recent versions of Java from Oracle, when you install the newer one, it will uninstall the previous, version of that, like Java 6 will uninstall the previous Java 6, but it won't necessarily uninstall the Java 5, Java 4 that may still be out there.
Right.
And it isn't always successful at uninstalling it when it installs the new one. So for a while there, you had to make sure you always went back and manually uninstalled the old one if you didn't need it anymore. Anyway, that's an aside. But
yeah, that was kind of what I was driving at. Thank you, Jim.
Oh, okay. And one of the interesting artifacts that you might see is in the far right-hand side of the screen here, I noticed that on my machine, it popped up, Windows Firewall popped up and said, hey, wait a second, Windows Explorer is trying to make an outbound connection. Do you want to allow it to do that? And what actually happens there is when the exploit succeeds and the malware loads, it injects itself into Windows Explorer, the Explorer.exe process. And it's actually running via that. So that's what we're actually seeing here, is we're seeing the malware running in an injected version of Explorer.exe, trying to make network connections back out to the command and control. In this case, I actually let it go because I'm working on a honeypot machine that I didn't have to worry about.
And this is Windows Explorer, which is the file browser, not Internet Explorer, which is the application that normally goes to the web.
Right, that's correct. So it's a good point. It's Windows Explorer, which is basically handles the management of your entire desktop experience for the most part in Windows. So one thing I wanted to point out here, and this is a very common thing as well that we notice, if you look at bluecellular.com, which I mentioned is the ultimate landing page where the Blackhole Exploit Kit web page is hosted, if you look up the WHOIS information, you'll notice that this domain was created today, which is a pretty clear indication that you've got a bunch of machines all of a sudden going to a domain that was created today. That's a little fishy. So in any event, we see that a lot. And what's probably going to happen within the next few days, if not today, this website will get taken down. Somebody will notify the registrar. The registrar will lock it and lock that domain, and they'll have to move on to a new one. So you'll frequently see that where these domains where they're hosting these exploit pages usually are created within the past week at least, if not less than that, with the past couple of days. Just a FYI on what the payload does once it drops. So it actually drops a Zeus ZBot payload, and we're going to talk about in a little more detail maybe. And it does that in a very similar way that it always does. It puts it into your documents and settings, user one, application, well, user one is your username, whatever that happens to be. Application data with a random name and a random name.exe. It always changes those. And it's usually letters. I don't think there are any numbers in there. And it creates a data directory file and a different random name under the same directory tree with another random name.ruc. And I think that's where it's keeping its config file stuff and et cetera. It also creates a run registry key, so it'll start up when the machine boots. It does it in an interesting way here. It's got kind of a hash that it uses. And then what you'll see is that it starts communicating with other peers over a peer-to-peer protocol using UDP, which I should have mentioned. This is all UDP traffic. It's a bunch of different destinations with different destination ports on UDP. And that's a little bit unusual for Zeus. Historically, Zeus has always been a HTTP-based command and control. And we were apprised that there is a peer-to-peer version of this out as of a few weeks ago, if not earlier. I think there was some mention of it back in late 2011, but it really started to pick up speed here in the past 3 weeks or so. And we'll take a look at that article. I think I have it here.
So, John, have you noticed, perhaps this is just significant to the sample that you were doing analysis on in this case, are we aware of any patterns in terms of the port selection that might be used?
You know, I haven't done an analysis of that. There may or may not be. I'm not really sure. There probably is some sort of algorithm it uses to figure out for this IP address, I need to go to this port, but maybe not. I really don't know. It could be a seed peer list that it has that I didn't see when I was analyzing. I didn't do a really super deep dive into the actual execution of the malware. But I'm not quite sure how it finds its initial peer list.
Okay.
So, some other interesting artifacts that you would notice about the binary, it has a copyright in it of 2Q3 Wet Corp is the company name, which I thought was interesting. Don't know if that means anything, but every one that I downloaded seemed to have that as its company name in the copyright. And it's digitally signed. Going back to Dave's earlier discussion, this is a digitally signed binary, but it looks like it's its own self-signed certificate. The name of the signer is basically a jumble of letters. There's no email address. There's no timestamp on it. There wasn't any ability to really get details off of it, so I didn't do a deep dive into the digital signature itself. But that might be an attempt to, trick users or trick other antivirus to say, hey, this is signed, so I'm just going to let it go by. Who knows? But as we know from Dave's discussion, they're stealing real digital certificates and signing as well as using just sketchy ones of their own self-signed type of activity. Just wrapping up pretty quickly here, the executable itself for the Zeus Trojan that gets downloaded, only about 10 of 42 antivirus vendors as of right now are picking it up. That's pretty spotty, actually. Not many of the big ones are actually picking it up. Mm-hmm. And another file that actually got dropped on the machine that I didn't mention was a Java class file. Only one of 43 vendors actually detect that as anything malicious. The one that did correctly identified it as a variant of Java exploit CVE 2011-350-3544. Which is actually the exploit. It's a Java exploit. You could probably go look up that CVE number and see how that works, but that's what that class file did. And I believe that's how it actually infected the machine I was working on.
I'll be asking you later who that vendor is.
Yeah. And just to quickly mention, I said we had some press not that long ago mentioning that there is a Zeus Trojan that is embracing peer-to-peer as its command and control. I think Matt might have even done a piece on this a few weeks back when this article first came out. This sample I'm looking at looks very much like that's what it is. I've also read on the press this morning that a lot of people are saying these LinkedIn ones might be related to Crydex. I can say after being in the trenches with Crydex for the past 2 weeks or 3 weeks or so, this is not Crydex. maybe Crydex is also doing a LinkedIn spam campaign that I'm not aware of, but the ones that I pulled are definitely a Zeus peer-to-peer based Trojan. So, and that's all I really had to cover on this, but I thought it was a good introduction into how the Blackhole exploit kit stuff works. And a lot of the initial parts, all the way up to delivering the actual malware, is the same for a lot of these different Trojans that use it, because a lot of that hopscotching around between websites, so you ultimately get to the exploit kit web page and your machine gets infected, is the same. So Crydex used the same kind of tactic. This one uses that. I know we've seen some other ones. I believe Cutwhale was another one that was using Blackhole exploit to do it as well. So they all have a very similar look and appearance in terms of their exploit tactic that they're using here. But once they drop the malware on the machine, it can do all kinds of different things. It depends on what they actually want to deliver to the machine.
Yeah. Very good, John. Very informative. Thank you.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and take a little bit a look at the internet weather over the last week or so here. And basically, I decided to use a little different format for the sort of the outline page here to see if this works out. What I've done is, in this case, pick the top 8 or so sets of activity that are significant from a security standpoint, and basically filtered out the ones that were less relevant or less significant. So rather than just use the, sort of the standard wallboard page that I've typically used in the past, I've been a little bit selective rather than just skip over those. So in any case, we'll take a look at some of these. The first one being port 6257. We'll take a look at that. That looks to be some P2P activity, although, and we've looked at that previously. It doesn't look like it's particularly malicious, but there are some strange behaviors, as I've reported on that before. An Internet Protect alert was posted, I think, yesterday related to TCP destination port 210. This is an increase in the number of sources that are probing on this port. We typically don't see scanning activity on this port. We'll take a look at it. It's kind of a new application, at least from my point of view, so a little bit interesting. We reported on this next one a number of times before. There seems to be at least some persistence in the interest on this one, although it's sporadic scanning. This is port 2967, associated with Symantec antivirus. The next item is actually related to anomalies in terms of the number of flows associated with destination addresses. In this case, they're categorized as family, basically indicating that they are customers of AT&T that are associated with this. I won't be going into specifically who is impacted by this, but basically this represents denial of service activity. And I think it's informative to take a quick look at what generally speaking, what kinds of activity are taking place in terms of denial of service attacks, and to show a little bit of an idea how frequently that type of activity takes place. So we'll take a look at that. There's some scanning activity on port 88, TCP, and this is related to some other activity that we've looked at before, so we'll take a look at that one. We've also seen some what looks like scanning activity on port 0 UDP. And this is a little bit of a curious one, a bit of a head-scratcher, and it looks like it may be packet fragmentation that's taking place here that tends to manifest itself a little bit strangely in flow data, which is what we're analyzing in this case. But these packets are generally 1,500-byte packets and a little bit strange, as I said. So we'll take a little look at that. Scanning activity on port 53, we reported on that last week. That's still taking place. And then last but not least, there is an increase in the number of sources that are scanning on port 3389. This is remote desktop protocol, and there was a recent vulnerability patch that was posted, as well as some exploit code in the wild associated with this application. So I wanted to make sure we took a look at that one. So drilling in a little bit here, as I'd mentioned, port 6257, this is associated with a point-to-point application, WinMX. This is a file-sharing application. The activity that we're seeing here is consistent with point-to-point files or point-to-point activity. So in that sense, it doesn't necessarily suggest a security issue, But showing the last 180 days of activity here, we can see that, over the last few days or week or so, we've seen some pretty persistent activity on this port, and then a long null period dating all the way back until December last year, about mid-December, and there have been some spotty places previously. So consistent with the way I've reported this in the past, it's not that this is the PDP activity here is of concern. It's the fact that it turns on and turns off. And in each of the cases where we've seen this, it seems like the profile of the users or the participants here are fairly consistent. And what I mean by that is generally the participants are mostly in Europe, some participants in the United States, and to a lesser extent participants in Japan. So it's not a typical demographic that you'd expect to see. It seems a little bit targeted, so to speak. Again, that doesn't necessarily suggest it's a security issue, but it does sort of suggest that there's something strange going on here. So if you have activity on this port, if you observe it, or if you have insight into what's going on here, please share it with us. But otherwise, I would be a little bit suspect of what's going on.
It looks like from that graph, Brian, that there was also some stuff going on early to mid-February at a very low level.
Yes, that's absolutely correct, Dave. There is a very low-level activity for a period of time between February 1st-ish and going forward perhaps the third week of February or up to the fourth week in February. And, yes, and we don't know if that's consistent with these other sort of more prominent sets of activity, which in those cases appear to be, if I were to take my conspiracy hat here, I would say this could possibly be a botnet that gets turned on when it's needed and then turned off, kind of put it in idle mode when it's not. So probably, again, if you see this activity, it's worth taking a closer look to see what that might be. The next item here is sources, that is the source addresses that are scanning on port 210 TCP. Now, this is associated with an application that is not very intuitive at all. It's ANSI Z39.50. It turns out that this is an application for library databasing. That is literally for keeping a database of the books that are on file in libraries. And curiously, just starting around, I guess we saw first inklings of it on March 18th, and then a significant increase in that activity on March going into March 19th, and then since then with a little bit of off periods here. It's a handful of sources in Korea, China, and also a little bit in the U.S. as well. And it's not clear how this could be used in a nefarious way, other than perhaps there's a vulnerability in the application that's used here and could take over control of machines. Otherwise, perhaps there's somebody interested in understanding what library systems are available to them. So in any case, if you're operating a library system, or if you know somebody that is, or using port 210, you want to pay attention to this activity as well. The next item, what I'll call sporadic scan probes on port 2967. We reported on this again last week. It's not unusual to see sporadic scan probes on port 2967. As we reported before, there was a vulnerability a few years back that was subsequently patched associated with Symantec antivirus. This is a port that's used for managing that tool. What we're showing here is 90 days of activity, and basically demonstrating that since about the end of February, 1st of March or so, we've seen some larger spikes in scanning activity. It's from a small number of sources. Most of the probes are from a source in either China or Korea. That changes depending on what time period that you look at. So, again, it's just sporadic activity. There may be other motives other than the Symantec antivirus that they're targeting, but our theory is that they're targeting machines that have been sitting out there and unpatched. The next item, as I'd mentioned, this was the anomalies on address blocks, and basically this is a composite of those anomalies over the last 30 days. And what I'm showing here is basically a difference. That is, there's a baseline of the activity that we expect to see on to these address blocks, but what we're showing is the difference relative to that baseline. That is the size of the anomaly. And what we're measuring here are flows. That is the number of flows that we see on a per-hour basis. And there are some periods here where the number of flows is exceeding, about 250 million flows per hour compared to the normal level of activity that we would have seen. And effectively what that means is each time you see any prominent spike in this data, which are probably too many to count here, probably 50 or 100 of those over the last 30 days, each of those would represent a denial of service attack against someone. And there have been, in fact, some more persistent activities over the last couple of days here that is noted at the end. So, again, I just wanted to share this with you so that you have a little better understanding. There's a lot of discussion about denial of service attacks. Every once in a while you hear about someone that's a victim of denial of service attacks. But this is something that does take place regularly, and if you don't have a planned defense for denial of service attacks, you could end up getting caught by surprise. The next item is scam probes on port 88 TCP, and one of the things that was observed here is that it's basically from a single source in China that is doing these scam probes. We see them actually, they're showing up. The port 88 was actually the red item here on the graph. But this source was also associated with doing probing activity on port 8080, port 8088, and port 8081. I'm going to move along rather quickly here. I already sort of talked about this activity on 0 UDP. It is very sporadic activity, kind of strange, as I mentioned, a bit of a head-scratcher. We're seeing generally 1,500 byte packets, which is typically the maximum packet size for a typical traditional Ethernet. And it may, in fact, represent fragmented packets that can show up this way, and it's mostly from sources in China and the U.S. Again, we mentioned scanning activity on port 53. This was reported on last week. Showing the last 30 days, there are some sporadic scanning events. There has been a sort of a rash, or what appears to be an increase in use of denial of service, DNS amplification attacks for denial of service. This may be probing around looking for DNS servers that will respond on the Internet. And probably one of the important ones to pay attention to is port, I've misspelled sources here, but this is the number of sources that are scanning on port 3389. This is remote desktop protocol. Jim, perhaps you can summarize really quickly what the status is on the exploit associated with RDP?
Yeah, there absolutely in the wild is a denial of service exploit. The Microsoft patched two vulnerabilities, remote code exploit, remote code execution exploit, and a denial of service exploit. The one that's in the wild is actually taking advantage of the one that could be used for remote code exploit, but the code that's out there is denial of service. Basically, what happens is you have to inject some code in there to do a heap overflow or a buffer overflow, and if you don't get that quite right, you end up causing a denial of service instead, and that appears to be what's in the wild at the moment. Okay.
So that's something to keep in mind. You know, generally the denial of service is a little bit, it's easier to make a machine go berserk than it is to do something nefarious that you want it to. So that denial of service step is a logical step in the exploit to get to the point where they can do something that's remote code execution. And we are seeing over the last few days an increase that is notable here, an increase in the number of sources that are scanning on that port. Now, I also want to point out that we do see, you know, sort of this type of activity as well in other cases. So we'll want to be paying attention to how that's changing over time, but there is some apparent increased interest in activity on that port. The last couple, there are just a couple real quick things I wanted to address with you here in terms of the top probed ports. Most of these are fairly the typical ones that we see. There is one exception, this port 27977, so let's take a really quick look at that one. I'm showing 90 days of activity here. We don't have a clear explanation for the motive for probing on this port, but we are seeing scam probes on port 27997 TCP. And we did find some indication on the internet that perhaps associates this activity with the TDSS rootkit. That's one of the master boot record modifier rootkits. We don't know specifically the context around that, but if you have information, we're certainly interested in hearing about it. But since about February 22nd timeframe, there's been a sort of a modest increase in the amount of probing activity we see on that port, perhaps looking for rootkit-infected machines. And last of all, again, fairly typical case here, top 10 most sources probing, port 445 far and above the others. Not really any surprises in terms of the ones that show up on here, other than the fact that that port 210 TCP does show up on the list, representing perhaps about 7% of the sources that we see probing on these ports. And with that, we'll go ahead and end the program. Any final comments from the team?
Nope. Interesting chart on the proxy scanning, the port 88, 8088 one. It seems like the pattern was exactly the same, but at different times.
Yes, that has been a sort of a pattern that's been showing up. Let me see if I can bring that one back here. Yes, so there's a sort of an initial spike and then sort of a trailing off set of activity. That could have something to do with the sequence of addresses that are being probed and the extent that they end up showing up on our network or something along those lines.
Right.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Dave, Jim, John, for joining today. I'm Brian Rexroad, and if you have any comments or feedback or suggestions for the program, please contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. You can get this program from the AT&T Tech Channel, that is techchannel.att.com. It's also available as an iPod download from iTunes. It's also available from YouTube. Just search for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today, and keep your network safe.